Well, a very warm welcome to tonight's Thinking. Already off to a great start with the music of the Stone Roses, which always, I think, adds class to any form of social gathering. I'm Matt D'Ancona. I'm an editor at Tortoise, and it's great to see you all here on this July evening to ask whether the UK can deliver its ambition to be a science superpower. Now, why ask that question at all? Well, because that's exactly the language, the ambition that the Prime Minister himself used, for instance, in a Telegraph article last month. It was also an explicit objective in the government's integrated review in March, and of Boris Johnson's establishment of a new National Science and Technology Council with the now familiar Sir Patrick Vallance as his National Technology Advisor. And the PM has committed in principle to increasing Britain's research and development spending from 1.7% of GDP last year to 2.4% by 2027, which would, at least in theory, bring it into line with the OECD average. Plenty of promises. The question is, are the Prime Minister and his colleagues willing to walk the walk as well as talk the talk in this very significant respect? As ever, we want to hear what you think. So please do chip into the chat, which is being ably helmed tonight by my colleague Ella Hill. And we have two superb speakers to help us frame our discussion. Dr. Kath Mackay is Managing Director of Bruntwood SciTech's Alderley Park, I hope I pronounced that correctly, the UK's largest single-site life science innovation campus, and a distinguished commentator on this and related subjects. We also have Dr. Alistair Henry, who's Head of Discovery Science and UK Site Head at the multinational pharmaceutical company UCB, and like Kate, a very respected figure in this debate. So let's not waste any further time, but dive straight into what is a multi-layered and very nuanced and important area of discussion. So if I might start with you, Kath. First of all, welcome. Thank you for joining us. When we talk about, you know, the UK being a superpower in science, what actually are the metrics? I mean, is it money spent? Is it the number of Nobel laureates we've managed to accumulate? Is it the university rankings? Is it the investment regime? I mean, what are the metrics we should be looking at?
I'm not sure there's a single metric, and I'm not sure if we're quite there yet. I mean, I think that we've got ambition to be a science superpower. I think, and you quite elegantly kind of captured the state of play in the slides that you showed to introduce this evening. I think we've got some way to go, but I think we've got the right ingredients for us to, you know, be a dominant force globally in science and technology. I think, I think that you could boil it down quite quickly to Nobel laureates and whatnot, but actually I think there are many different types of KPIs and success criteria we could look at. I think we could look at the growth of UK companies, the number of successful trials completing, the number of drugs getting into people in the UK. They're all success metrics, but I'm not sure there will be one or two single metrics that we would necessarily use. I think you could quite easily boil it down to a set of KPIs, but I think we need something a little more than that.
Yeah, something broader. So I mean, to that, I can remember when the coalition government was in power, George Osborne would routinely make speeches about life sciences, and Theresa May was also very keen on British scientific advance. Is it fair to say that, as claimed, this version of the Conservative government that in various forms has been in power since 2010 is making a step change? I mean, has something culturally or in terms of the configuration of Whitehall or in the minds of Number 10 changed that means that we should be taking this promise more seriously than at any time since 2010 or indeed before?
I think what there has been is that there has been clear and sustained investment in life sciences in the UK. I think that it's a start of a 10. I think there could be more, but through initiatives like the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund, there have been significant investments into UK infrastructure that are crowding in businesses, and they're supporting the SMEs that dominate the life science industry. I think some of those investments are, and we know about them now because of the vaccine story, for instance, but there's been £210 million worth of investment was announced prior to COVID into the medicines manufacturing industry. So investment into clinical trials for cell and gene therapies, investments into vaccines development and manufacturing. There have been investments into whole genome sequencing, but through the UK biobank samples, so that there's a shared data pool for large and small businesses in the UK and internationally. So kind of really playing on the UK strength in genomics and understanding patient cohorts. So I would say that the step change, it's not necessarily a step change. I think there's been a clear investment into that public and clinical infrastructure and manufacturing infrastructure into the UK, which is, I think, coming of age at this time. So I think that we need more of that, really, because that's the framework that industry can tap into to grow and scale. So industry can partner with these large centres to understand how to manufacture their products. Industry can partner with these centres that are generating and cleansing patient and laboratory data. And I think that's been a significant and smart investment, actually, over the last 5 to 10 years. So I'm not sure. I think, I'd say more of a kind of coming of age, really, kind of backing onto sustained investments into health and life science infrastructure in the UK for a number of years. But I see it really, I suppose, is the start and not the end of that. I think that it's a realisation that we need these shared investments for industry to flourish.
There was a fair amount of disappointment in what might loosely be called the R&D community about what was announced in the budget, and some concerns that Peter might be being robbed to pay Paul in order to, well, you can explain this better than I about the Horizon Europe project, but to what extent did you share in that disappointment?
I think that given, I think there was a lot of concern around, it appeared to be an increase in the life science budget from the government, but there was a concern that actually by having to pay our obligations to Horizon Europe, it would actually result in a reduced science innovation budget. And I understand.
Can you just explain what Horizon Europe is for the
Absolutely. It's a European funding scheme to boost innovation in SMEs and organisations working in broad science and technology. So it's grant funding essentially that comes from Europe to support the development of new innovations in life sciences and forward technology. And we actually are still eligible to take part in that scheme, and as long as we essentially put into it through to government funding. And the government committed to supporting Horizon Europe, and therefore has to make a financial contribution. And at the time of publication of the budget, I think there was a big fear that despite the perceived increase in allocation to R&D, by having to cover obligations in Horizon Europe, the pot was essentially shrinking and getting smaller. I understand that that's actually no longer an issue, and a different source of funding has been found for that. But I think there is a concern around, I suppose, innovation spend broadly still. I'm here as someone who works with and supports businesses, and I think that one of the points I'd like to make is that investment isn't, that there are different types of businesses and organisations that need to be supported. I used to work for an organisation, for instance, called Innovate UK, which is now part of UK Research and Innovation, and it's the way that government incentivises innovation in businesses, and businesses will have a very different set of drivers, KPIs, needs than academic establishments and charity organisations, for instance. An increase in innovation funding will be felt very differently by different types of organisations. And what I think we need to impress on government is that there's got to be clear funding for businesses, and that won't come necessarily through funding UKRI and individual research councils. There's got to be a funding stream for businesses who are developing their products and services, particularly at a mid to late stage, to be able to apply into. And I think in the last settlement, Innovate UK, as a for instance, didn't have the security of the other funding councils. And there's got to be a clear pathway for businesses to be funded and supported that we haven't actually seen yet. We've seen the Innovate UK launch its the Biomedical Catalyst, which is one of its funding schemes that supports businesses in the life sciences. I believe the current funding round is in the region of £18 million that companies can apply into for a share of. And what we need is a long pathway of sustained funding for businesses working in the life science sector, which we don't see at the moment. So I think that there is, I suppose, talk around increased funding in health and life sciences, and I think we can all be very supportive of that. But I think we need to ring fence that funding and ensure some of it goes to some of our best businesses working in the UK.
That's very interesting. We'll come back to you, Kath, and thank you for that. Alistair, can I welcome you too, and thank you very much for taking part tonight. And perhaps just start off with an obvious case study, because when I mentioned to a few people in government that I was doing this event tonight, there was mention of UCB in the Windlesham campus as being, very much a case study in what we're discussing this evening. It's in Surrey, I know, and the Minister's quite excited about it. Can you explain what it is, why it's so important, and why it might be a kind of signifier of where we're heading?
Yeah, thank you. It's the reason why it's important for us is, firstly, it allows us to continue to cement and grow what we think is already an excellent research base that we have in the UK. So tapping into UK talent that we have built up over many years, and we needed a new home effectively where we could continue to grow that. So it's important for us to be able to continue to develop that and to nurture that which we've already have and what that already contributes to us as an organization. But staying here not only enabled us to continue what we have, if you like, but we recognize actually within the UK, we have already great collaborations, great connections with the academic sector. There is a real talent base that we want to access, continue to access in the UK, and to pull in that talent base to support what we wish as our ambition in terms of generating value for patients, changing patients' lives. And so the UK is an environment where we think that can be nurtured. It's not a perfect environment. I think it would be wrong to claim that, but it is an environment where I think the language is right for us, and we can build with that, as long as there is the long-term vision. We need that's also part of this for us. So we have an existing talent base we need to sustain. We recognize that there is a real talent pool around us, and we recognize as well that there's opportunity to bring in talent that is not currently in the UK. And as a workforce, we are very multinational, and there is a place for people to be here that can be supported and nurtured. And that's why we have invested. It turns out to be in Windlesham. We're pleased to have done that to really grow what we wish.
Right. So you've got the site, you've got the infrastructure, you've got the ambition to network in academic talent and indeed talent from overseas. That sort of begs the question about what environment the UK needs to have more of that, and what measures need to be taken, if any, to make the UK more investment friendly. I know that it's the strategy of UCB to invest quite a high proportion of its revenues into R&D. That isn't by any means a typical strategy for companies. What what sort of things should the government be doing in terms of, specific policies to make more of this happen? And it can range, I imagine, from visas to investment law to corporate tax law.
Absolutely, and it is a wide spread. Again, for us, it's not a single entity, a single policy, if you like. It's the whole breadth of policy. Now, I'm not going to claim to be an expert in UK tax law, but we are already putting 29% of our revenues back into R&D, which which is a huge proportion for us. And in order to do that, we do think we need support from government to continue those type of activities. The movement of people, visas, etc., again, to attract high quality talent to support the organization, to work with us. But when we think about the wider piece for us, the academic environment and ultimately the NHS as well, when we move from research actually into clinical development, again, an environment where we can have access again with regulators to look forward. Remember, we are operating on a 10+ year timescale from project inception to actually taking it to the end of a program. So we are having to have long-term policy and long-term stability is what, as an organization, we really value. And so that's, again, part of what would really encourage continued support and investment for organizations like ourselves.
So when you're dealing with government, and there's quite an alphabet soup, isn't there, now of organizations, and they're proliferating, and there's a dynamism in that proliferation, but there's also risks, which is that to quote Henry Kissinger, when I phone Europe, who do I phone? Is it easy for you as a company to know who to deal with, who to pick up the phone to get the help and the nimbleness that you need?
The simple answer is it could be easier.
Maybe the most diplomatic.
And because the danger is that we end up falling between the stools of one department and another, where one doesn't quite fit in one department and not quite fit elsewhere. That's a risk. And so the more joined up that is for us, that clearly is an advantage. And of course, UCB is a Belgium-based company, so we're not actually resident here, although we are researchers here. So again, that's a complexity that adds just to the mix. And again, so where do we fit in those discussions? So again, simplicity would be something that would be, I suspect, an advantage for many.
And has that simplicity been helped or hindered by Brexit? Because you hear two completely different narratives in the scientific community on this. And I wonder if the truth doesn't lie somewhere in between, but I'd love to know what you think on this one, Alistair.
I'm going to steer a little bit clear of the political minefield of Brexit.
By all means, it's a fact.
But to say this, though, is that obviously it matters to us, and we have worked hard as an organization to navigate our way through the various changes, both within the UK and in Europe. And I think that's part of learning the navigation. We're not alone in having to do that, and we've therefore been able to mitigate and be able to move forward and progress. Now, it is the political environment, but we're resident here, our research activities here in the UK, and so it's going to be our interactions with the UK government that matter for us as we plan the future of those type of, we move in that space. So yes, Brexit, I guess, it added complexity, but it was already complex, I think it would be fair to say, beforehand. And so we're used to dealing with the complexity.
Right. The final question before I move on, which is connected to the, not your own business, but the joint vaccine task force, which seemed to break the mold to some extent in its the extent to which it was alive, both to the need to be adaptable and nimble, keen on venture capital. Are there learnings from the success of that enterprise? Because it seems to me that went very well in ways which weren't just the fact that we got AstraZeneca and it all worked out and we're all getting doses now. But the JVT really did perhaps offer a different model of the connection between government and the scientific community and indeed the financial community.
I do think it does offer a different model. I think you're absolutely right. And the vaccine wasn't the only example of that. There was the COVID moonshot program, for example, looking for a small molecule follow-on from a vaccine position. There are other examples here. I do think that where there is a joined up realization of the need that is clearly in this case, it's a global pandemic. We are looking beyond self-interest. There has to be means where we can facilitate that, and self-interest, whether that's government or corporate or any other self-interest, even academic self-interest, can be set aside for the collective good. And it's obvious that we can do that. We just have to have the right motivations and, in fact, actually the right shared vision. For me, the biggest piece here is the shared vision to be able to drive forward those types of changes. And once that vision is shared and bought into, then that's where the impact can be had.
That's incredibly interesting, Alistair. We'll come back to you very shortly. Can I go to Katie now, who in the chat was making some very interesting points about the relationship with the EU and funding programs. Katie, I don't know if you're there.
Hi, yes.
Hi, Katie, good to see you. Rather than me try to paraphrase the very interesting points you made, why don't you tell us all what your views are on this?
Okay, so I mean, I think that there's no way that the UK alone can work in certain disease areas when you're talking about the life sciences. So a lot of my career was spent working in what are called rare diseases. Obviously, it's self-evidently they don't affect an awful lot of people. So they're not the heart attacks, they're not the cancer. There may be things like cystic fibrosis, spinal muscular atrophy, muscular dystrophy, Huntington's disease, things that people may have heard of, but maybe don't know someone who's actually had them. And there's been a huge initiative in the EU for the last 20 years to put these on policy agenda at national government level. And this has led to a huge amount of investment from the pharmaceutical companies through a whole set of incentives, orphan drug legislation and so forth, and also individual funding programs for researchers and for networks. And the UK has battered way above its weight in this area. I mean, there's been leadership in different networks. There's been a whole load of funding way beyond the weight of the UK otherwise that comes to rare diseases through these programs. And I think that what we risk by saying that, okay, the UK can make up for the shortfall in funding programs in the EU, or it can participate in the EU funding programs, what we've lost in this is our leadership. So we had a huge amount of leadership in these programs. We were determining policy. We were showing the way to people in these kind of programs. And now we're not even allowed to be members in some of these areas. And I think that that's something that's going to take an awfully long time to replicate with collaboration in other parts of the world, even if we wanted to, because actually the Europeans are our closest neighbours. And clearly for rare conditions, you have to work beyond a global level. And if we give up these networks, then we really risk losing that very precious set of collaborations.
Do you think it's very interesting the way you frame it, Kate, is very interesting, because you look at it very much as a supranational.
Yeah.
To play devil's advocate, is there any mileage in the way that the Prime Minister and co are looking at this very much through the national prism? That there is a way of directing strategy in scientific research, which is, though not exclusive of international, of course, primarily treats science policy almost as an aspect of foreign policy and security policy.
So in the I don't think that we ever felt pre-Brexit that we didn't have access to collaborations anywhere. We truly were working globally. It wasn't that our horizon was narrowed to Europe, but Europe gave us a platform to be big on the world stage. So I think that what we've lost with this is a context where we were bigger already than Britain, but we were clearly still leading. It was an unspoken leadership, which was the way Europe works, isn't it? It works on consensus, it works on collaboration. But everybody knew that Britain was doing better than other countries in terms of their funding levels and their leadership in different consortia and so forth. So what we've lost by this kind of banging the drum all the time about it has to be global Britain, it has to be Britain first, is that actually we do better if we keep quiet and we're a little bit kind of more humble about the fact that we're doing well, because collaboration is actually key to in so many different medical areas, not only the rare diseases, but cancer, heart disease, and so forth. You know, one of your headline on this, which brought me into your debate, was about genomics. Now, yes, we've done very well in the UK through investment in genomics, but you know, genomics is a global issue. We've only done well in genomics through COVID, in my opinion, because we've had that basis of all of our collaborative structures that have brought us to this point in the last several years. We didn't do it on our own. We were in a good position, but we didn't get there alone over the last 10 years or 20 years or so. So, you know, it's a myth that you can do it alone in science as any nation, and Britain is not huge. You know, even the US doesn't do science alone. So we have to be a bit more humble about all of this and recognise that we can take a really important role, but we do it in collaboration with the rest of the world.
Thank you so much, Katie. I'd love to come back to Kath Mackay now, because not least because she's written about the impact of Brexit, and I'd love to hear her thoughts on this. Kath, what do you think about the? You know, it's no longer really a political issue. It's a fact. It's happened. So the question is, what are the opportunities and what are the challenges of Brexit for the scientific community in this country?
I share Katie's concerns. I think my feeling is that everyone's just got to work a lot harder. And I suppose coming back to the European funding matter is that in a way, it doesn't matter if you're in or you're out. You may be eligible, you may not be eligible. I think there's just this perception that the UK is no longer in the game, and I think that's the concern, isn't it? I think with everything that's happened over the last couple of years, there is this concern that we're not up for European collaboration. And I think it's been very, very damaging. So I know when I was in Innovate UK a couple of years ago, and this was all playing out, a number of European companies were not being invited to join consortia that they would have otherwise been invited to join. I think there was a real kind of feeling of risk actually bringing UK organisations into some of these big projects, because no one really knew how it was going to play out, and I think the UK's commitment took a bit of a bashing. So I completely agree with the concerns that Katie's just shared with us. And so I suppose a lot of it is around not fact or fiction, but around the perception of what the UK can and can't do now. My organisation, Bruntwood SciTech, we own a large UK network of science innovation campuses, and we work closely with DIT, Department for International Trade, on investment opportunities. They're very supportive. They will be dealing with international companies that are looking for a European home, European, not kind of EU, but anywhere in the continent Europe. And we'll have companies that are looking at one of our sites in the UK, like Alderley Park, but they're also considering sites within mainland Europe and EU. And the Brexit question comes up, and whether it's a real barrier or not, it's definitely in the minds of some of these US companies that we're speaking with. And I feel that actually, there's nothing necessarily preventing them coming and joining one of our sites, but I really feel that we've got to work a lot harder and work with the agencies like DIT and other government bodies to really reassure companies that we're open for business. So I'd say it's not that we've shut the shop. It's more, I think we have to work a lot harder for all of these opportunities, and we really have to articulate that we're open for business. I think we have to articulate the benefits of being in the UK a lot harder than we would have had to do kind of 3 or 4 years ago.
I mean, the interesting thing is, and this brings us to, I suppose, what we have to call the Dominic Cummings thesis, which is that, okay, you know, Dominic Cummings is not perhaps the person you go to first of all for optometric advice, or indeed human resources counsel, but he did have some, at the very least, interesting things to say about science and technology in the UK. And one of them was that too much bandwidth was being devoted to dealing with Brussels that needed to be liberated to focus upon the specific challenge of science and technology and R&D in the UK. And I just wondered whether you had any sympathy with that view, Kath. I mean, you know, not as it were endorsing Cummings wholesale, but that particular point of view.
Yeah, I mean, I think he was quite openly up for busting bureaucracy, wasn't he? And I think you know, anyone that's applied for, I think, a research grant at any point of their career would have some empathy for that, you know, for that position. It's tricky. I mean, I think that I've got some sympathy. I think we all want funding to be a simple and more straightforward process. I think they really, you know, you've got to be in it to win it, and I don't think we should be alienating ourselves from Brussels or from any kind of large you know, system or organisation. So I don't know if I do agree, actually.
Right. Well, that, again, it's fascinating to hear Cummings, you know, sort of thought of in that, wearing that hat. I noticed he released some more information today about how he felt that, you know, his job was to liberate the Prime Minister from thinking about Brussels and to make him concentrate on science. So it's an interesting, it's a very interesting way of approaching it, though not, I suspect, quite as black and white as he presented. Alistair, if we can come back to you, again, to not to Cummings the Politico, but to the person who was, you know, the driver behind ARIA, which is the kind of UK version of DARPA, I guess. Tell us what you think about ARIA and whether it is all that he and its other champions think it might be.
I would like ARIA to succeed. I think having ambition and having grand ambition is not a bad thing. It can help focus. It can help create a point, you know, to head for, or a small number of points, as it were. So, to the extent that it may well help do that, then I think it has some merit. But I do see also, though, some pitfalls. The question is, what is it going to be targeting? Who will determine, you know, those goals? You know, what are and are they politically determined in that sense, or are they, what is it, societal need, etc.? You know, how will we measure or determine that as we set out on the journey? That's the first piece. The second piece is I see a risk that it does set up a competition with elsewhere in the funding network, if we can call it that, and that creates a tension that might not necessarily be helpful in the longer term, because people will wish to shift their emphasis to join the ARIA expedition, as it were, rather than staying true to what they think are the key areas that we need to innovate in. So there is a risk that it will narrow things too far. So I like the concept of grand ambition and supporting that, but it needs to be supported substantially to get to its ultimate goals. I think those have been certainly, you know, within life sciences sector, we know that these types of goals do not come cheap, and so therefore it needs to be funded appropriately, as well as the goals being appropriately determined and stuck to. You know, with a long term, you know, none of these things are done in 2 years. We need to realize that we are looking 5-10 year horizons, and as long as those parameters stay there, then I am actually largely supportive of ambition to make a big difference.
But what does a successful ARIA look like? I mean, we can salute the ambition, and admire its kind of Manhattan Project style zeal. And that's terrific rhetoric. But what does it actually mean in terms of the day-to-day lives of researching scientists and companies?
So as long as we can, this is why the question of setting the goals becomes so important here. If those goals are so either diluted or so disparate from, for example, company goals, then we'll find ourselves we will walk away. People will walk away, in terms of companies. And they will do their own thing because they will have their own funding, their own budgetary abilities. So there's that piece of alignment that is necessary. That's the first thing. But if that is there, then there should be the will to collaborate. If we are going to be light touch in terms of the way it is governed, there has to be, not putting the bureaucracy in because of the size of the budget. There is an element in there that has to be set and set the course and then direct the outcome. And there's a wait for it. I see that there's the danger I see is that I'm not sure government are comfortable to step back for a moment and allow the innovation.
Yes.
That's where I see the danger. If we can allow the innovation, then it will grow. But if it's not allowed, then it will be stifled.
Because the reason that Vint Cerf and his colleagues invented the internet at DARPA was because they were just left alone to play around, effectively, wasn't it? With, it must be said, colossal sums of Pentagon money, which is two quite big ifs. We'll come back to you, Alistair. I just want to go back to Kath and ask, relate to another broad theme in the government's kind of suite of objectives, particularly as it hopes to exit from the pandemic, which is levelling up, and what role that science and R&D policy can play in levelling up. Because at the moment, there is, frankly, at least a perception that there is a golden triangle of Oxford, Cambridge, and London. But that doesn't seem to me to be compatible with the levelling up agenda. So what role can science play symbiotically with that?
I think that there's a huge opportunity for using science and technology to level up. I am also on the board of an organisation called the Northern Health Science Alliance, which is essentially the gateway into health and life science research and innovation in the North. It's a membership organisation of the 10 research intensive universities in the North, 10 hospital trusts, and the academic health science networks. And it's an organisation that's working to strategically coordinate the health and life science research in the North. So as you can imagine, this organisation is very active and very vocal in this area. I think we don't really understand at the moment what the government's plans are for levelling up. I think there's a lot of talk about it, but actually, we haven't levelled up yet. Despite a lot of talk about it. So I think there's a question mark really about kind of what the government's plans are to level up, especially in science and technology. But I think there's a huge opportunity. And what we're doing in the Northern Health Science Alliance is really thinking about what are the UK and world-class assets that we have in the North. Because I think the ask to government shouldn't be, around levelling up, shouldn't be, it's our turn now, can we have some funding, please? I think it's really our responsibility as an organisation leading health and life science research in the North to really have a deep understanding of what are the assets that we have that are truly world class, that just so happens to be in the North, and what are the true areas of expertise that we have on our patch, as it were, and then to, I suppose, work with government to get those funded and get those supported. There is a so-called golden triangle, but there's also a really maturing health and life science ecosystem in the North. So I think about areas like Manchester, where there is Europe's largest clinical population, Liverpool City region, where there's expertise in infectious diseases and medicines manufacturing. You've got huge medicines manufacturing and advanced therapies capability in Teesside and Darlington. And I think rolling off the tongue, I can think of IBM's recent £210 million investment into the Hartree Centre in Daresbury, Manchester University pressing the go button on their 1.5 billion ID Manchester Innovation District Manchester campus that's going to be developed over the coming years. There are huge, I suppose, areas of expertise and opportunity in the north around life sciences and technology more broadly. And I think it's really a case of us getting our story straight and making it very clear about these assets, and that we've got some UK and world-class capability that's ripe for investment. And that's something that we're working on in the Northern Health Science Alliance and working very closely with industry. So I think that I think it's up to us to kind of really put forward what we've got in the north and have I suppose, a strategic conversation with government around those particular areas of expertise. I think as well, we are still a small island at the end of the day. If you think of the size of California and the size of the UK, I think that's how we should be seeing ourselves, really, as a large state, and collaborating, which we already do, with organisations and businesses in Oxford, in Cambridge, and London. So I think it's very easy to think of it as North v South, but actually, it's getting the UK offer and the Team UK shirt on, really, and making sure there is a UK-wide coordination. Because I think that's the only way, to go back to some of our previous discussions, that we'd be able to have serious conversations and compete internationally. So absolutely opportunities to level up, but it's not it shouldn't be North versus South. I think that there's a lot of collaboration happening between our businesses and institutes and organisations across the UK, and it's just to make sure that we're very much speaking internationally as Team UK, because I don't think internationally businesses will care whether you're speaking about Manchester or you're speaking about London. I think that we very much have to make sure that we've got our UK offer well mapped out and articulated.
But the won't, I take it, be a real levelling up without quite a lot of political will? I mean, you can have individual projects that regionalise and you've already listed some of the very impressive examples of that. But to be true to the sort of levelling up agenda that the Prime Minister talks about, you actually have to have quite a busy engine of political will in Whitehall, don't you?
I think you do, yeah. I think it's got to be a clear policy. And I think the government's got to be very clear about what it wants to do. And if it wants to do it, articulate that better and make some investments.
Yeah, absolutely. Can we go to Professor Lucy Hubermann, who had some interesting observations about DARPA and ARIA? Lucy, I don't know if you're... hi, Lucy, how are you?
I'm good, thanks.
Good to see you.
Yeah, I hate to say that ideas of Dominic Cummings sounded interesting, but he did blog quite a lot about DARPA and ARIA and innovation. So I suppose I'm interested in innovation. It's not always the same thing as science funding, but they can obviously go together, and they particularly go together very well in medicine. I'm not equipped to be an expert on the other sciences. But I have noticed, as someone who's been working in a university for 12 years, that the space for fundamental research, or discovery research, as we used to call it, is very small. And the funding for sort of incremental innovation, like better batteries or more Internet of Things, is quite high. So it's quite hard to be engaged in a sort of future-focused agenda, which can build in stakeholders like business and overseas from the beginning. And that's why I like the sort of DARPA, ARPA, well, I don't know, ARIA was talked about and then seems to have disappeared, models. And Regina Duggan, who's the new head of Wellcome Leap, was a DARPA head. She did a podcast recently with Azim Azar on exponential view, and I listened in and asked some questions. And I was really, really struck. I mean, obviously Wellcome has quite a lot of funding, which is great, but I was really struck by the call for the person, I think they're called program managers, which doesn't sound very high powered or sexy, but they have an enormous amount of latitude. And I think by that token power, because they design the programs. On the whole, there isn't supposed to be too much meddling. And on the whole, they're long term. So I recently looked at Wellcome's got a 8-year discovery program. It's one of its new programs. Now in UKRI funding or in normal government funding, there is nothing like that. And I will end by saying that 15 or 20 years ago, when I first joined the innovation space, there were a lot of programs like horizon scanning, future focus, and scenario planning. And they were government departments, had their own teams. They all worked in an interdisciplinary way to define versions of the future that we might be facing, that they or we could work towards. And that all seems to have gone, and I don't know if that's austerity or mindset or what. But I am not against these new forms of funding. I don't feel the competition is bad, but there are different kinds of research, like, you know, short-term, medium, long-term. And in the UK, we've got a horrible track record of sort of DTI legacy of research funding, which was all to support market failure, which I find as a concept going into research hard to understand. I mean, I hope it's changed a bit now, and I'm sure your speakers can talk about that. But I did a lot of work in the West Midlands when it wasn't so up and coming as it is now. The regional development agencies were all about, well, we didn't call it levelling up then, but it was about bringing money to the regions. There's the Strength in Places Fund now that's trying to join up the dots in regional for research. But levelling up, I think, just to finish, also requires political will, but also social policy interventions. It's not all about science.
Are you, Lucy, do you feel instinctively that central government has the wit, the will, the kind of perspicacity to do what you're talking about? Because you describe an age when there were bodies within Whitehall that were devoted in quite a systematic and intelligent cerebral way to this. But you also, I think, I'm sure correctly, praise the arm's length principle. So the question is, how do we strike that balance?
Well, what they used to do was provide an interesting research-based framework of, there are methodologies to look into the future that are actually quite yielding of good results. It's not all, fantasy. It's very expensive work to do. So it's more about the government providing, or the departments to providing a thinking framework and then putting funding towards the problems. So I don't know why it's gone away. I don't know if it's party political. You'll know more about changes in Whitehall and government than I will. But these things go in and out of fashion. I mean, just in my last 12 years, I feel I've just, on the engineering and science side, it's all been about batteries, the Internet of Things. All the fundings come through, and they all are broadly in the same ballpark. And I just can't believe that's right. They are small incremental things. So what I think I do think we are crying out for is some longer term thought. So for example, I was speaking to someone yesterday who was in the same lab as Adrian Hill, who, 15 years ago, that lab started putting down the markers and creating the possibilities for the vaccine that Oxford have now launched. If we're not funding research now into things that we don't know how they're going to be useful in 15 years ago, but will be useful in 15 years, that's a bit scary. And where does that kind of open-ended funding come from?
It's a very good question. Thank you so much, Lucy. Alistair, can I come to you on a slightly different question, which is related, I suppose, to what we've learned in the time of COVID, and also what we're learning about the new geopolitics. I know AI is not what your company specializes in, but it's certainly the case that America and China are now engaged in a massive geopolitical battle over AI and other communications technologies. And the same is happening to a certain extent in the life sciences. Are these geopolitical tensions of benefit to the world of science, or do they end up mutilating the potential for collaboration? That's for Alistair.
Yeah, I'm just pondering.
Sorry.
Pondering, Matthew. It's the sound of thinking you're hearing. So I'm curious. So let me take one step backwards. So, like all organizations, we will use AI-based technology. It's a way of understanding and looking at data. So now the question for us becomes the access to data to which you apply those methodologies and to what purpose. So then the question now then of the sort of the geopolitical of who owns what, it's more about who owns the data, the access to the data, and then what are the questions that you will set to that data. So we will use those type of methodologies for the smart design of clinical trials, for example. We will use those type of methodologies to look at, for example, the phenome-wise studies to look for indications of targets, new drug targets, from new medicines. Those are the type of questions where the data sources are vast, and we need to think about the data in a different way. So do I see it as a geopolitical thing? As long as we are able to gain access collectively, whether it's the academic sector, whether it's companies, how we do that and working together, but that the data access, then we apply essentially the mathematics to that. But we've got to ask the right questions of that data. And so I think we will find, different people will develop different platforms, different mathematical approaches to this. There's not a single answer. So I don't see that tension, to be honest, in what we are trying to achieve in life sciences. I guess that's the point. Now, whether it's how these things are used elsewhere, in terms of cybersecurity and those type of questions. Now that's a different, that's well outside of my territory. I have to say that, but that's where I, of course, see the geopolitical piece playing out. But within the life sciences sector, I don't see it quite in the same light.
Thanks, Alistair. Can I come back to Kath and sort of pose a variant, to use a loaded word, on that question, which is, we are emerging from a period which must be regarded by any standards as one of enormous learning. And, the international landscape has been transformed by the departure of Trump, but also, more importantly, by everything that has happened since the pandemic struck. And I'm very curious what you think that means, that sort of landscape means for the world in which you work and live. Has it made life easier? Has it made collaboration harder? How has it changed those prospects?
I think yeah. I mean, the sound of my kind of thinking as well, similar to Alistair. I think you obviously asked us the easy question tonight. I think, yeah. I mean, it's obviously been very divisive over a number of years, and I think changes in US policy, I think, are going to be welcomed. I think advances in the Pasteur Act and global health being back on the agenda in the US is a very, very positive thing. So I think that in that respect, I think things have got easier over the last couple of months, and I think are poised to get easier. Kind of without stating the obvious, and I suppose repeating some of the previous comments, I mean, science it's an international sport, isn't it? So I think we need those strong networks, and we need to be able to work arm in arm with organisations in other nations. To go back to the previous question about kind of AI and data, we need that kind of collaboration and interoperability to get new products and services to market. So it's absolutely fundamental that we've got that easy working relationship with our neighbours across the pond and in other countries too. So I think it's been a tense few years, but I think it's going to move to a better place with changes in the administration.
So the net effect is you don't feel that the UK and indeed the EU are being crushed between a kind of science crazy America and a science crazy China, to put it at its crudest.
No, I don't think we're being crushed on. I think we're able to hold our own. And if we can go back to the exam question, that's brought us here together this evening. I think we've got all the right ingredients. We're not there yet. But we've got all the right ingredients to be that science superpower. And I think we need to back ourselves through the world leading organisations and infrastructure that we have in the UK. We all know the rhetoric. We know that we've got a permissive regulatory system. We've got the NHS and everything that brings in terms of a single care provider and data sets and whatnot. And I think we need to back ourselves that we can be that kind of steady level force globally in health and life sciences. So I don't think we're going to be crushed. I think we just need to know the plane in which we're working and go for it.
Thank you very much, Kath. That's a very, very good and strong note on which to end. Sadly, the hour is coming to an end, and it falls to me to try and gosh, from so many fascinating points to distill some sort of takeaways. I can't say everything, but I'll try not to say nothing. I'm reminded of that wonderful line in if you're a fan of the Aaron Sorkin series, The Newsroom. It's not, but it could be, which is that it may be that it isn't. It's a bit premature to call Britain a scientific superpower, but there's no reason to assume that it can't become such a thing if the right decisions and the right strategies are pursued. I mean, one thing that's come out, I think, very clearly is that for all the issues associated with it politically, which we can put to one side, Dominic Cummings was certainly onto something, not just in establishing ARIA, brackets, to be discussed, but also in his enthusiasm to take the whole issue of vaccination out of the Department of Health, put it in a task force and give it that kind of independence, which has paid off and continues to pay off, I think. On the question of R&D, this seems to me to be the area where we wait to see, both in terms of how imaginative we can be as a country in encouraging venture capital, inward investment, and so on, but also the extent to which the government will live up to the promises it's made. Brexit, clearly, again, like the French Revolution, too early to say. Its defenders argue that it offers nimbleness. Its detractors say that it slammed too many doors. And I think that we'll be unable to form a definitive judgment on that in the short term, but certainly the burden of proof lies with those who advocated such a dramatic change in our international arrangements. I was fascinated by Kath's points about levelling up, and I think that this brings us really to the concluding point, which is something that both she and Alistair emphasised throughout, which is that none of this really flies without a really strong political will, strategy, and a coherent vision. And we know that populist governments don't do that sort of thing, so that the onus is on this government and indeed its successors to pursue this, because it is clearly so important to the future of this country, both economically but also culturally and geostrategically. So it couldn't be more important. Hugely grateful to Kath and Alistair for their time and for their insights, and to all of you for joining us on this summer evening. We'll be back at lunchtime tomorrow with open news, and then in the evening with a thinking on cyber warfare, which is again a variant on the theme, and we look forward to that. Meanwhile, thank you all, enjoy your evening, and thanks for coming.